John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the history of the 72nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry of the Mounted Lightning Brigade. Chapter 20. June 24th to August 16th, 1863. Rosecrans' army moves forward. Lightning Brigade in advance. Charge and capture Hoovers Gap. Brave dash led by Colonel Kirkpatrick. A bloody battle in the rain. Thrilling incidents. Babes in the wood in the storm of battle. Sergeant Pike's face shot off. A cannon shot passes through Chaplain Eddy. Casualties of Battle of Hoovers Gap. Raid on Detchard. Captain Rice in a close place. Sleeping and slipping up and down a mountain. Bragg scared and evacuates Tullahoma. And camp near Wartrace. Filth. Green flies and maggots. How dirty the rebels could be. Camp at Rose Hill. 4th of July in camp. Thompson, our poet. Scouting and details of how it was done. When the Union split, I split too. Move to Deckard. Summary of first year's service. The regiment reduced almost one half. On the 24th of June, the bugle sounded the reveille at 3 in the morning. Up, feed, get breakfast, and move at daylight. We reached Murfreesboro and find that the whole army of 50,000 men have struck tents. What a change in one short night. One can never realize it till one sees it. Everything is loaded on wagons, and the regiments, brigades, and divisions are rapidly taking their places in lines. We move right on through the town, passing the horrible old camp and the Hickory Flats, and take the road for Wartrace, moving southeast on the Manchester Pike. Companies A, F, D, and I were advanced guard of the regiment. The weather was cool and lowering, and rain began to fall in the forenoon and continued all day, pouring down in torrents in the afternoon. The men were cheerful, for all that, in broad contrast with the weather. We strike the rebel vedettes, 10 miles out from Murfreesboro and 5 miles from Hoovers Gap. We promptly charge the picket post. And they as promptly set out to spread the alarm. Soon a company of cavalry attempts to check our advance, and they, too, are driven as chaff before the wind. We kill one man, capture others, and take a flag inscribed, "Presented by the ladies of Selma, Alabama." A coincidence that in our first battle we should capture this flag, and almost 2 years after, in our last battle, we should capture Selma, and the ladies who presented the flag, too, perhaps. We press on. As the rebel force opposing us increases, we strengthen our skirmish line, and bear down upon the retreating rebels with such impetuosity that the motion of our column is not checked until we near the mouth of Hoovers Gap, where we find a line of rebel cavalry extending from one hilltop to the other, across the little hollow through which we are moving. They open and keep up a constant fire on us from one end of the line to the other. Here, Company C comes forward, and with A, F, and D in line, and I and C in column, we give them such a push that they fail to rally at a line of breastworks and a cannon they had planted in the gap, and run on at a fearful rate. Company C here turned attention to some camps on the hill to the left, and captured a signal station, with all its train, camp, and garrison equipage, This station had first signaled General Hardee that the attack was only by a small reconnoitering party of cavalry. A lucky mistake for us, leaving us in undisputed possession of the gap. But we did not stop here. A, F, D, and I just charged right on in column after the retreating fugitives, who scarcely took time to fire a gun, chasing them into the little village of Beach, 2 miles beyond the gap. Here the column checked up, and Lieutenant Colonel Kirkpatrick, who was in command, went into Jacob's store to get some caddies of tobacco, brought them out and began to distribute the tobacco to the men, while firing is still going on in the front between the regimental scouts and the enemy. But hark! Just to our right and rear, a half-mile away, 100 drums began simultaneously to sound the dread long roll. A staff sergeant comes dashing down the road and yells to us, "Get out of this as quick as God Almighty will let you." We about face and move briskly towards the gap, the rebels following, and encouraging our efforts with repeated shots. During the melee, in which the 4 companies were engaged, the head of a column of Brigade had passed through the gap by the earthworks and captured the piece of artillery. Colonel Miller grasped the situation in a moment. This was the key to the whole position, and 2 hours later could scarcely have been charged and taken with 10,000 men. Colonel Miller immediately sent Company H out on picket to the right of the road and Company E on the same duty to the left, on a by-road, and formed the other 4 companies on the brow of the hill to the right of the road. All this time, the rebel drums are beating the long roll furiously, which gives Colonel Wilder the situation of their camps. The 17th is hurried up to form on the right of the 72nd, the 98th Illinois still further to the right, and the 123rd Illinois to the right and rear in reserve, our battery of mountain howitzers in front of the 72nd, and the 18th Indiana Battery directly to our rear upon the highest ground. The 4 companies come back in a hurry and take place in line. The rebels following us cut off Companies H and E from the road. By this time the 2 divisions of Hardee's Corps, encamped to our right front, scarcely a mile away, have gotten in line and send forward a cloud of skirmishers, who soon strike Company H, and for a time its situation is perilous in the extreme. Such as the company began to fall back, W.R. Clark was shot in the abdomen, the ball coming out at his back. 3 or 4 comrades quickly dismounted, helped him on his horse and hurried him to the rear. The company, by a circuitous route, gained the rear, and took its place in the line. By this time, rebel skirmishers are at short range with our line. They come up in splendid style and in plain view. Our howitzers and 4 pieces of artillery open on them and pour volley after volley of grape and canister into their ranks, as they rush upon us with hellish and deafening yells. On they come, as if determined to take the battery without firing a gun. The 72nd opens upon them with our 7 shooting Spencers, and for the first time, they seem to wake up to the fact that they are not fighting cavalry. They stagger and fall back in confusion. The weight of the charge has struck the 17th. The sharp clatter of rifles is deafening. From some cause, the 17th is soon out of ammunition, and some commotion is visible. Now the 98th Illinois change front and come to the rescue, and the rebels are hurled back. Now the 123rd Illinois move to support of the 98th, and the rebels open on our mountain howitzers with a battery of rifled guns. 3 shells in quick succession pass through our regiment. One cuts one of the gunners in 2. Another tears off the face of Sergeant Pike of Company D, and another passes through the neck of an artillery mule. As the rebels have more and heavier guns than we, our battery of howitzers limber up and get out of the way, and it seems now but a question of a little time when the 18th Battery 6-pounders will have to do the same. At this juncture, the rebel infantry move upon us. outnumbering us 5-1. But our splendid Spencer repeaters more than compensate for the disparity in numbers. When they close up on us, the clash and crash of small arms is added to the deafening roar of artillery, and the din is terrific in the extreme. The struggle was desperate, but brief. The rebel infantry are again sent staggering back. Their artillery yet holds supremacy, and every shell they send over us and at our guns increases our anxiety and the peril of our situation. For if they silence our guns, there's nothing to prevent them from shelling our ranks at their leisure. We are in extreme peril. A large chunk of railroad iron, thrown from a rebel cannon, strikes in front of Company D near Sergeant Garrett's head, throwing mud all over the company. Another large shell strikes just in front of the colors, and before it has time to explode, Corporal Drummond, Company I, one of the color guard, jumps to his feet, seizes and throws the shell down the hill, which explodes as soon as it touches the ground. Brave and timely deed. Our peril increases with every moment. At this critical moment, the 19th Indiana Battery, Captain Harris, with guns 1/2 caliber larger than those of the 18th, 10 horses to the gun, came thundering down the road to our relief. The drivers urging the horses with whip and spur until they were frantic with fury. For once artillerymen are permitted to ride on their guns. Captain Harris takes position and opens immediately on the rebels. As the guns belch forth fire and shot over our heads, we feel great relief and anxiously watch the telling effect the shots have upon the enemy. And in a short time, the rebel guns are seen to limber up and move to a more respectful distance. It is now almost sundown. We've been lying in the mud and water for nearly 4 hours, for the rain has come down in torrents all the time. We were not heavily engaged any more that day, and at dark were relieved by Crook's brigade. It would take many more pages than we have to spare to note half the incidents of this battle, yet we cannot forbear speaking of a few. After dark we fell back and lay on our arms in reserve. All had done their duty so well that it was not possible, without being invidious, to give special praise to any. We have not yet ascertained what became of Company E, and will give their experience. Soon after they found that they were cut off by 2 rebel officers came up to them, supposing they were part of the rebel force, and did not discover their mistake until it was too late for them to escape. Just then, the rebel artillery began to rake their position, and the skirmishers also began to fire on them. The company started to move across the woods, and immediately came upon 3 little children, who were bewildered in their efforts to escape from the dangers and awful noise of the battle. 2 little girls, aged about 7 and 9, and a little boy aged 5. These were veritable babes of the woods. The girls could outrun the boy, but every minute would stop, turn, and cry, "Come on, Bubby, come on!" Sergeant Wilhite, amid a shower of bullets, dismounted, helped them over the fence, placed the boy between the girls, and started them towards a house, out of the range of the fire, remounted his horse, while the bullets rattled against the fence, and rode away unhurt. At such an act of tenderness, would not the angels smile through the smoke of battle and protect the brave man who did it? Company E got out in safety, and took place in line while the battle raged. There is not space to speak of hair-breadth escapes. The mortal wound of Sergeant Pike in the face has been spoken of, and to see him lying in the mud and rain, clawing the mud with his hands, and ever and anon picking at the shreds of flesh and shattered bones of his face, was horribly distressing. His face was all shot off. It sickens us to write of it. Death soon came to the brave man's relief, and we all thanked God to see our poor comrade out of his agony. Lieutenant Cravens informs us that he stood over Sergeant Pike a short time before he died, and said, "Pike, don't you know me?" The poor fellow muttered, "Oh, mother, poor mother, what will she do?" He spoke no more, and soon expired. He was a noble man, and the support and pride of his widowed mother. He was buried near the line of battle, where he fell. Clark, of Company H, has been mentioned as being shot in the abdomen. Dr. Cole says, quote, "The ball went through the skin on the abdomen, but did not penetrate the muscles, passed around his body, and came out at the back, exactly opposite the point it entered, just as though it had gone straight through him. He soon got well and served out his time." Unquote. Other casualties were Sergeant James Opede, Company G, a good and brave man, mortally wounded in the left lung. Private Peter Moore, Company A, musket ball through the left shoulder. Daniel Long, Company E, broken right forearm. P.C. Burnham, Company D, bayonet wound. John R. Bennett, C, musket ball through left lung. E. Bannister, D, slight wound on knee. A.J. Hubbard, B, musket ball in left shoulder. William Grismar, K, wounded in thigh. J.R. Rutherford, B, slight wound in head. J.K. Sheets, K, wound on shoulder. The most impressive event of the day was the killing of Chaplain Eddy. The regimental hospital was established over the hill, in rear of our regiment, and the chaplain was near it helping with the wounded. A shell of the enemy fired at the 18th Battery passed over it and over the hill, and through the chaplain's body, killing him instantly. We have said that the night before he had preached his first sermon to us in camp at Murfreesboro, exhorting us to be prepared for death. To be taken from us thus, on the first day of service, and the brave discharge of his duties, was a matter of sorrow to every heart. His name will be ever dear to the 72nd. We quote from Colonel Miller's notes. "We were under fire for 5 hours. This was our first battle, and the men stood well. We had 3 men killed and 20 wounded, some of them mortally. We were relieved by Cook's brigade after dark, and lay on our arms in the mud that night." On June 25th, the whole of the 14th Army Corps came up and formed line where we were yesterday. Skirmishing commenced early, but our troops were content to hold the splendid position gained, for the capture of which we claim the honor belongs to our brigade. We lay in reserve all day, and the rebels showed their spite by throwing shells at our forces, while the clouds poured down rain. The 26th opened with rain, and we moved east and south up a fork of Duck River, passing through some narrow defiles where we pick up a few prisoners. The rebel army seems to be falling back. We camp for the night in 6 miles of Manchester. On the morning of the 27th, we were in the saddle early, and dashed like fury into Manchester, surprising the place and capturing 300 prisoners and a lot of commissary stores. We remained there all day while part of the brigade made a reconnaissance towards Tullahoma. The 14th Corps came up in the evening, and the rain continued. On the morning of the 28th, we set out from Manchester to raid on the Chattanooga Railroad, going by way of Hillsboro, Pelham, and Hawkinsville, 45 miles to Detchard. Duck and Elk rivers were so swollen by the rains as to swim all the mules and small horses. At one place we carried the artillery ammunition across on our horses, and at the other made a raft to ferry the artillery over. We reached Deckard at 9 o'clock at night, The bulk of Bragg's army was at Tullahoma, 15 miles north of this place, and hence we are right in the rear of Bragg's army. We found Deckard garrisoned by a small force of rebels in stockade, and scattered them with a few shots from our howitzers, lacking guns, we always called them, because we used mules to haul them, and often took them to pieces and strapped them on the backs of mules when we traveled very hilly country, as was frequently the case. While this was going on, Captain Rice started through the village to give directions to scouts who were burning the water tank, tearing up the railroad, and working all possible mischief in a great hurry. He had dismounted and was quietly leading his horse when suddenly some rebels began to fire on him from a stockade. The bullets rattled against a fence and scared his horse, which jerked loose from him, leaving him in quiet and unpleasant predicament, and his chances for Libby prison good. His horse did not run from him, but just as he caught the bridle, another volley, and another rattle of balls against the fence, and again the horse broke away. This was repeated, the captain's hair standing on end, until the horse got out of range of the bullets, and then the captain mounted and went out of there like a bird flying. He regards this as his most daring feat during the war, but confesses that he was a little scared. The first thing captured was the rebel mail. The depot was burned and a short section of the railroad torn up and a bridge burned. The command then hurried away 6 miles northeast to a point on the Cumberland Mountains, and as records has it, ambushed for the night. That is, simply stopped in the bushes and lay down to sleep, holding our horses' bridles in our hands. We had put in another hard day's work in the rain, and our beds were on the mountainside on the sharpest of rocks. The mountain was so steep that we had to get our feet against the trees or rocks to keep from slipping down, and had not the surrounding been so desperate, it would have been funny to see us try to sleep. You see a big, stout, long-legged soldier laying down flat of his back, his legs stiff, and his feet braced against a tree. In 2 minutes, he is asleep. His muscles begin to relax, his knees fly up, and down he goes astraddle of the tree. With many, the remainder of the night is worn away in sliding down the hill and climbing up again, while others, more fortunate, find a hole or a depression, the rain still pouring down, and 2 hours later they are called upon to find themselves in water 6 inches deep. On the 27th, we were in saddles by daylight, and moved on a bypath to the top of the mountain, as we were apprehensive that the enemy had thrown a force between us and Pelham. When near the top of the mountain, a fearful thunderstorm came upon us. We were so high, or the clouds so low, that we were in the clouds, and the thunder was as often below as above us. The average soldier took but little interest in this grand sight, knowing only that the situation was uncomfortable. To many of us, the sublimity of the scene dispelled thought of discomfort or danger. God seemed very near. The want of rest and sleep was telling on us, and we were constantly falling asleep and reeling in our saddles like drunken men. The route was almost impracticable, and the howitzers had to be pulled up by hand. When we got to the top of the mountain, we could see reinforcements pouring in to Deckard. The rebels had been struck suddenly there, and were fearfully scared, not knowing whence the Yankees came, or whither they went. On the top of the mountain, each man was ordered to take a sheaf of wheat for his horse, and the column moved forward on the trot to University Heights, whence a detachment of the 72nd and 98th Illinois, Colonel Funkhauser in command, hurried to Cowan to burn the trestle work of the Memphis, Chattanooga, and Charleston Railroad, but on getting in sight of the place, found rebel troops pouring into it by thousands, and returned to the column. While Colonel Funkhauser's detachment was gone, the brigade tore up the railroad at Tracy City, as this was a short road running to a coal mine, The object of tearing it up was never visible to the naked eye. It still continued to rain. Many horses gave out and were killed, while others were left to fall into the hands of the rebels. The constant rain had swollen the Elk River out of its banks, and the bridge at Pelham was our only chance of crossing. And should the enemy destroy that, our chances of escape were slim. Just before going down the mountain, a detail from Company I, Lieutenant Vance in command, was pushed forward to the bridge and arrived in time to drive off a rebel force that had just reached the bridge. Our boys tore up the floor of the bridge, carried the boards to our side, built breastworks of them, and held the fort until morning. We remember the names of but Munson, Wyatt, and Allen of Company I, who took part in this brave and important work. The brigade went into camp immediately on coming down from the mountain, and for the first time since leaving Manchester, we had a chance to make coffee. On the morning of the 30th, we succeeded in getting across the bridge with but one man wounded, although Wheeler's rebel cavalry were pressing us hard. In actual damage done to the enemy, this expedition was a failure. But in neophying the brigade and giving each man confidence in himself and his officers, it was a grand success. The rebels had hitherto had it all their own way in raiding railroads. This expedition demonstrated that we were just as competent to raid rebel railroads as rebels were to raid Union railroads. This raid had a very demoralizing effect on General Bragg, and he began to evacuate Tullahoma in 2 hours after he heard the report of our guns at Deckard, thinking he had been flanked by the whole army. We failed to say it rained all day the 30th. July 1st was the first day since we left Murfreesboro that it had not rained. The brigade scouted towards Wartrace in the rear of the retreating army, having traveled 300 miles in a little over 3 days, and lost over 500 horses. We were told we could have a short time to recruit up a little. On July 3rd, we went to Wartrace and went into camp on the ground recently occupied by the rebels. The strongest imagination could not exaggerate the vast accumulations of filth which we saw here, and at many other places. Our men often remarked that it seemed as if the rebels expected us to drive them away from their camps, and for our especial discomfort, left as much filth behind as possible. Looking back over nearly a year's service, we see that the very first thing we have done on going into camp, even for a few days, has been digging of sinks, and from our first entrance into the service until now, we have digged enough sinks to make a respectable Suez Canal, where they all joined together, or a ditch of sufficient capacity to drain the Conakay swamps. But up to this time, we have never seen a rebel sink. They seem to revel in filth, and 1,000 mingled stinks must have been sweet perfume to their nostrils. The deluge of rain which had fallen in the past 10 days had soaked the ground until the whole face of the earth was a reeking sea of carrion. In many places, as we walked over the ground, we could hear and see the sputtering water through which the noxious gases arose to high heaven, blending 1,000 filthy smells into one, which no Christian olfactory could withstand. Countless thousands of green flies flitted about with nasty, lazy drone, like the hum of 1,000 spindles. These flies were constantly depositing their eggs on the ground, on the leaves, on everything, which the broiling sun soon hatched into millions of maggots, which wiggled until the leaves and grass on the ground moved and wiggled too, and in a short time they hatched into flies and added to the swarms in the air and laid more eggs, and etc. We are willing to risk our reputation as a faithful recorder of historic facts in saying that we have seen acres and acres of ground covered with leaves that were in a constant quiver from the motions of the maggots that infested them. Every member of the 72nd will remember our camp on Maggot Hill as long as he lives. There is an abundance of evidence to prove all we say. The nuisance was so intolerable that we were given permission to clear off a new camp a mile away, which was done by details on the 5th of July. This camp was near Rowisville, and we moved to it on July 6th. For several days, we did little but forage for horses. Shortly after moving to Rowisville, our good doctor went to a house near camp and spoke for his dinner. By good luck, the lady of the house had a chicken to fry. The air around the cabin was filled with the savory smell of the frying chicken, and the doctor's mouth began to water in anticipation of the change from HT and SB to such a delicacy. But unfortunately for the doctor, just when the fowl had reached the stage of brown that indicated a job well done, the lady of the house stepped out of the door, and so did the chicken, skillet and all. There was some foul play in the matter, and a man in Company H could tell who did it, but as he didn't sign his own name, we will not give it. The whole country was full of wheats and oats standing in the fields, uncut, and foraging for feed for the horses was a matter of pleasure and a light duty. But food for ourselves was scarce. Aside from a few apples, potatoes, and blackberries, the country afforded nothing. All our government rations had to be hauled from Murfreesboro in wagons. The roads were a vast swamp, and it was next to impossible to get any hauling at all done. Blackberries were fortunately plenty, and with these, and what hardtack we got, we could manage to live. On the 4th of July, there was hardly a cracker in the regiment, and it is a dry 4th without crackers. So we sought to make up our deficiency in rations by an extra issue of O rations. This 4th will long be remembered as one of the bright days of the gloomy years of the rebellion. We were in very high spirits in our Tennessee camp, even if the maggots and green flies were sporting in shoals and oceans, and had we known that Lee had been defeated at Gettysburg, and that Vicksburg had surrendered, our joy would have been unbounded. Perhaps we sniffed the good news from afar, and inhaled the spirit of rejoicing, which made the loyal North ring and roar with delight and thanksgivings. We gathered in the afternoon at headquarters, and Colonel Kirkpatrick, who was the only politician in the regiment, was called out for a speech. He responded in one of his happiest efforts, when he spoke of the dear old flag, the stars and stripes. In a grand burst of eloquence he said, quote, "They should wave over the land of the free, and the home of the brave, when the last mother's son of the rebellion should be dead and rotten, damned and forgotten." Unquote. We cheered him to the echo. He was followed by Sergeant Major B.M. Thompson, and for an hour we had a grand oration. This occasion was an oasis in the many dreary days of our service. While having a few quiet days in camp, in this sweet-scented country, we have leisure to state that at Murfreesboro the 72nd conceived and brought forth a poet. In this same Sergeant Major Thompson, who became an institution in our history. From the opening of this campaign to the close of the war, the regiment made no important move that he did not reduce to song, in such lively verse that, if published, would hand the regiment down to posterity as the embodiment of all that is chivalrous, generous, dashing, and good. His poetry is not in elegant style, but quite forcible in expression. It would be a pleasure to insert it all in this volume, in connection with the circumstances described in each piece. But poetry fills space so rapidly that we are compelled to leave it out. We have it all before us, and should the sale of this book justify another edition, we promise to insert it in full. On July 10th, we moved camp to near Normandy, on Duck River, 9 miles from Tullahoma. On the 13th, Colonel Miller took a detail of 20 men from each company in the regiment, and went on a scout north and west through Shelbyville and Unionville to see if the rebels had all left the country. We traveled 75 miles, captured a few rebel prisoners, and returned on the 15th. On the 16th, we scouted the Elk River to see if the rebels had all crossed and found none. Also on the 16th, the 72nd and 98th, Colonel Wilder in command, went on a scout to destroy some saltpeter works near Lynchburg, Tennessee, and returned on the 17th. It was on this scout that Corporal John T. Haynes' Company I captured the famous old fighting cock, Methuselah, which was never whipped in many fights. The old bird furnished much amusement to those who enjoyed it, and many a rooster went down before his gaffs, after he became a member of the 72nd. On the 18th of July, the regiment was paid off from January 1st to the 1st of May, 4 months. On the 21st, Colonel Wilder of the 17th went home and left Colonel Miller in command of the brigade. On the 22nd, a detachment of the brigade under the gallant Colonel Funkhauser of the 98th Illinois, who was always on hand for his share of the hardest and most dangerous duty, consisting of part of the 92nd and 98th Illinois, and 10 men and a non-commissioned officer from each company of the 72nd. Captain C.G. Thompson in command, went on a scout to capture horses for the 92nd, and also to fill up losses of horses in the brigade. This detachment passed through Shelbyville, Unionville, Chaplain Hill, by Thursday, Columbia, and Hunt's Store, part of the country where our troops had never been, and secured stock and forage in abundance. As this was a very important scout, in which Sergeant Stewart of Company A says 1,154 horses and mules were captured, we record a few of the many exciting personal incidents, begging pardon for not giving all the vast pile that lies before us. The command moved at 8 a.m., passed through Shelbyville and camped 4 miles from Unionville, after the precautionary information that we were to move through a section of the country infested by bushwhackers. Furloughed rebel soldiers. We were commanded to begin to forage for stock and able-bodied Negroes. Each non-commissioned officer was trained as a guard and a rallying point for the bands of scouts. Thus allowed to take all his 10 men except 2, who were left with the pack train, and guard, moved along the main road while the scouting detachments took any direction they preferred, all to report to the officer in command at the train at certain points agreed upon for camping overnight. Sergeant Stewart, commanding the detachment from Company A, reports the capture of 30 horses and mules during the scout. Taking this as an average for the capture of each detail from the 72nd would make their aggregate capture of horses during the trip 300, or 3 horses for each man on the scout, which is about correct. Records of Company I furnishes the best account of this scout. Of the work on July 23rd, he says, "My detail had to serve as rear guard for the column until late in the afternoon when scouts began to come in. When I got permission from Captain Thompson to draw from detachments of other companies and go foraging, I had just learned that some men were running a threshing machine on the south side of the Duck River. Taking 2 of my own men and 2 others, our whole party being 5, I started. Several parties that day had tried to get on the south side of Duck River, but failed on account of high waters. We reached a point from which the machine could be seen in the distance. I told the men I wanted to go for that machine. Other of our regiment came up at that point and said they would go and see us try it, but didn't feel like running any risks themselves. We struck the river at Maury's Mills, but the bridge was in ruins. A man at the mills told us that there was a ford just below, but it was deep and dangerous. Just then I saw a horse hitched by which I told belonged to a boy who was then in the mills. By this time several squads had come up, and we went down to the ford. The river looked so formidable that I wished the men would decline to go further, but one of them said, "Go in and try it," and rather than back out, I put into it. The water run over my horse's back, but I pushed ahead and called out, "Come on!" With a whoop, they dashed into the river, and all got speedily over in safety. The boy had crossed in a canoe, and was flying off on his horse to alarm the threshers. But we pursued and soon overtook him, and learned from him that the threshing was on Gray's plantation, that Gray was a captain of company of rebels, and that his company was guarding the threshing. I directed some of the men to take charge of the horse and boy, but we had not gone far until I saw the boy running across a cornfield, and saw in a moment that this was likely to spoil the arrangement if we failed to reach the machine before the boy, and that we might get our hair raised. We dashed off in a gallop, and as we neared the machine raised a whoop and a cheer, making as much noise as a regiment. The noble guards, 3 times our number, broke for the cornfields, jumped the fence, and disappeared in a trice. We stripped the horses and mules, 12 in number, and put the Negroes upon them, and fearing the rebels might find how few we were, slip back across the corn and pay us their respects, we dashed back, crossing the river in safety. The rebels, having lost their Negroes and animals, were left to their own reflections, and we never heard how Captain Grade finished up his threshing. We moved on through Unionville and Chaplain Hill, and camped that night on Rutherford Creek. On the 24th, we quote John B. Davis, Company D, our advance was fired on by bushwhackers, 2 of whom we captured. We advanced to Columbia, where we had a slight skirmish, and turning back, camped on the farm of a Major Allen, who was then in the rebel service. On this march we were instructed to state to all persons from whom we took property that if they would come to camp and establish their loyalty, their stock should be returned to them. We had a native guide with us who knew those who were loyal. We give a sample day's scouting by the detail from Company D, which illustrates the work of the whole command. On leaving Spring Hill, we came to a house where a young lady was holding a horse by the bridle. On entering the house, we found a revolver and a saddle, pockets filled with apples. Coming out, we asked the lady for the horse. She threw her arms round his neck and declared we never should take him. We disengaged her arms, took the horse, and moved on. The next place was a large plantation where we found 3 mules, 2 in the gin house, and 1 in the lot. We unhitched the 2 from the gin and went for the 1 in the lot, when the old lady came out and said, "Lord Almighty, you uns don't want that mule. He's done 25 years old." We took him for 8 years old and moved on. We next secured a fine horse, the owner seeming to care very little about it. One of the native guides came up and told us that the owner of the horse and himself had hidden together from the rebels in a cave for 6 months. We wouldn't take such a loyal man's horse and returned it to him. We next took a horse from the rebel Colonel Haynes. Next came to an old woman who was weeping bitterly. It wouldn't be so bad to take her horses, but we had taken her Negroes too. We asked her if she was a Union woman. "No," said she. "When the Union split, I split too." The scouting party returned to camp at Roseville on the 27th, found the brigade had gone to Deckard, followed and reached there on the 28th, bringing in 1,000 horses, 1,500 mules, and 1,000 Negroes. We lay in camp at Deckard from July 27th to August 16th, the longest period of inactivity since we were mounted. Aside from a little skirmish drilling and foraging, we did nothing. The 10th Indiana was at Winchester, a few miles from us, and we had a pleasant season of intervisiting. At this date completes our first year's service, and marks an epoch in our history. We note the changes in our regiment since our last review up to January 8th, when we went into camps at Murfreesboro. Captain R.B. Hanna, Company H, had been detached as Provost Marshal, on General Reynolds' staff. At Deckard Station, Company H was detailed as Provost Guard at General Reynolds' headquarters. Sergeant Major W.K. Barnes has been promoted to Adjutant of the regiment to succeed A.A. Rice, who had been previously mentioned as promoted to the rank of captain and made A.A. generals on General Reynolds' staff. Chaplain Jesse Hill resigned April 13th, succeeded by Reverend John Eddy, of whose brief service and death by a cannon shot at Hoovers Gap we have spoken. John B. Johnson, assistant surgeon, resigned May 3rd. Captain Milton Newton resigned February 1st, and Andrew Klepser succeeded him. Frank B. Everett, First Lieutenant, Company C, resigned February 16th, and Edward A. Cutshaw succeeded him. Noah N. Inslee, First Lieutenant, Company E, resigned February 19th, and Lewis C. Priest succeeded him. Captain Moses Birch, Company F, resigned March 23rd, and James L. Dalton succeeded him. Orrin He Harper, Second Lieutenant, Company F, dismissed March 1st, and Johnson Parker succeeded him. W.R. Jewell, Second Lieutenant, Company G, resigned from sickness. May 19th, we re-entered service in July, next as captain of a company at Indianapolis, the company not being ordered to the field. He resigned and accepted the chaplaincy of the 7th Indiana Infantry, and served until its time expired. James Gladden succeeded him. James M. Stafford, First Lieutenant, Company H, resigned June 11th, and John C. Scott succeeded him. John Watts, Captain, Company I, dismissed January 19th, and William H. McMurdy succeeded him. Captain Hiram B. Collins, Company K, resigned April 21st, and Richard H. McIntyre succeeded him. John W. Gaskell, Second Lieutenant, Company K, died at Murfreesboro February 20th, succeeded by James W. Davis, making 11 commissioned officers resigned, 1 died, and 1 killed. In Company A, non-commissioned officers and privates died 2, discharged 6. Company B died 6, discharged 19, killed 1. Company C died 3, discharged 6, drummed out 1. Company E died 10, discharged 12, killed 1. Company F died 6, discharged 9. Company G died 4, discharged 11, deserted 1. Company H died 1, discharged 11. Company I died 4, discharged 10. Company K died 2, discharged 6. Total for the regiment: died 38, discharged 90, killed 3, deserted 1, drummed out 1, making the total loss of the regiment from January 8th, 1863 to August 16th, 1863, in officers, non-commissioned officers, and privates, 146. To this add the loss of the first 6 months, 98, and the total loss for the year is 244. We left Indianapolis with 978, and in this first year we have lost just 2 more than 1/4 of our entire command. With perhaps 1 or 2 exceptions, every officer had resigned on certificates of disability, precisely the same ground upon which non-commissioned officers and privates were discharged. Perhaps 90% of this heavy loss was caused by the horrible filth pit at Murfreesboro, before spoken of. In addition to the losses above alluded to, there were enough absent in hospitals to make a total loss of 300 men and 9 officers. Deduct those transferred and on detached duty, and there are about 500 men in the regiment for service. At Castilian Springs in 1862, there was a general overhauling of the non-commissioned officers of the entire regiment, nearly 1/2 being dropped from their places and others substituted. But after that, in most cases, officers were advanced in regular order of promotion. Chapter 21. We are going to do the next week. Let's get into our notes. We have a bunch to talk about. We're going to break out some maps and we're going to get started in talking about where these guys are going and what army is doing what in relation to the Grand Campaign, and talking about some of these personal antidotes that they are so kindly able to give us, and also rage at some others where they didn't. So with that, my friends, let's hop into some show notes. All right, so we're at 1 year of military service. These guys are veterans at this point, and I want to make a note that if you're going to be doing research into Hoovers Gap, and just kind of like that area, just be prepared for a lot of participation trophies from ignorant and poor white people that don't understand that they weren't considered Southerners or part of the South and were just cheap cannon fodder for the rich so they could keep owning black people. So just be aware of that now that we're kind of entering into the South. There's a lot of that going on when you're doing research for these areas. Now, at this point, right before the launch of the Tullahoma Campaign against Bragg, on July 4th, Lee retreats from Gettysburg that night with the Army of Northern Virginia in shambles. And Vicksburg surrenders to future President Grant, General Grant, along with like 30,000 troops. So even in the space of just a couple of days, 50,000 Confederate troops just evaporate, which is just amazing. And this campaign, while having very little bloodshed, is able to force back a Confederate army out of Tennessee for a little bit, which is incredibly important, but is also, and as General Rosecrans would put, is a little overlooked. So, and for a reason. All right, so we're going to move on to Hoover's Gap, an excellent account of this battle. Today, if you wanted to go through the area, this battle takes place at the modern, tiny little town of Beech Grove, which is at a crossroads between some highways and some interstates in Beech Grove, Tennessee. If you guys look it up, you will see the Hoovers Gap Road that kind of splits off and goes to the 64, the road that's there. And in between that, in this kind of big area of wooded branches, is where this Hoovers Gap battle had taken place when the rebels are countering attacking. And you'll see a Beech Grove Confederate cemetery that's nearby. And these are the guys that were hurling themselves into Federal soldiers' bullets. Now, the description of this battle is excellent. The detail that is afforded to us, I think, might be one of my favorite of all time. I know I say that a lot, but maybe even more so than the Battle of Gettysburg by the 155th Pennsylvania. It's as good as it gets when it comes to detail. The idea of also the idea of coming across little children in the middle of this battle is very interesting as a survival story. And the surprise attack on the Rebs, the long roll of the traitors' drums beating out to get everyone ready for combat, and the repulses of the enemy's attack is just excellent writing. Absolutely so well written. I just absolutely love this. What I don't love is the graphic description of Sergeant Pike being hit in the face with a cannonball and having it rip his face off. Really solid nightmare fuel. Incredibly sad, as his last words are for his mother. I think we can all imagine what that was like for her back home. But it's just so crazy that this man is like, I'm a terrible writer, and he's doing such a great job of being able to afford us what it was like to be there during this campaign. Now, the descriptions of the movements after this, where they're working as, I know they're mounted infantry, but they seem to be working as cavalry. Excellent. But after many hours, I have failed to find the mountain that they climb over. I am not sure which one it is. It is to the east of Tullahoma. I I have some ideas, but because I don't know for sure, I'm not going to throw any out there. But many of the towns that are mentioned in this episode, it looks like a lot of them haven't changed since the war, so feel free to take a gander at a map if you have one handy. Otherwise, don't worry about it. But I know my personal favorite of this episode is Colonel Kirkpatrick giving his speech about the Stars and Stripes. And he says, quote, "They should wave over the land of the free and home of the brave, when the last mother's son of the rebellion should be dead and rotten, damned and forgotten." I literally could not have said that better myself. Such an excellent use of words to describe traitors and what should happen to them when they take up arms against the Constitution. But next is a more important, even more than this, which is cockfighting. I'm sure someone has done research on maybe animal cruelty in the American Civil War, the amount of animals who have died. I do wonder about the logistics of cockfighting while being in a mounted infantry regiment and how long that rooster stayed with these men, whether it was for a weekend or a couple of days that they were just rounding up cocks to fight each other or roosters to fight each other. Just crazy. So interesting. The practice of having animals fight each other for amusement by soldiers is still one that continues to this day. It just happens with different animals. I've seen it firsthand. So very interesting to see that in the middle of all of this campaign that's going on, they still make time for that. So very interesting. All right. When the Wilder Brigade is moving around and they're stripping the traders of horses and other animals, food, and then they run across this old woman who complains that the Union Army has taken her livestock and her human slaves. And so they ask her if she's a loyal citizen, presumably to give her horse back. And she says no. And I don't know what she expected, but at least she's an honest trader, which is one of the first things that came to my mind. And that is a lot more than can be said for the actual leaders of the Confederacy, who were two-timing traitors, who outwardly said, "I love the Constitution, I swore an oath," but they were actually actively working to undermine the country at that time. So props to this lady for at least being a horrible person openly. Now, this raid that they do also frees 1,000 human beings from being enslaved. 1,000. 1,000. Just great American heroes these guys are. I'm telling you what. All right, so at the end of their service, these guys are at the end of 1 year's service, I should say. They've lost a little bit more than 1/4 of their entire command, which is crazy. I mean, but during this time frame, you would bleed losses, and it was worse during the Napoleonic Wars. If you look at casualty replenish rates for the Napoleonic Wars, it was just absolutely nuts. All right. Now we're going to come to the most heartbreaking thing to talk about. And you would think it might be some of the other things, but we're not looking at the perspective of someone who is associating with these folks. We're looking at historians. And that is B.F. McGee not including their sergeant major's poetry for every event that they came across. That fills me with rage and sadness. It makes me boil because poetry, as any historian will tell you, in the context that it was written, having it go alongside this book would be worth its weight in gold, bricks and bricks of gold. And it is so painful to know that it is out there somewhere, hopefully, and we just don't have it. I would like to see that companion piece just all buttoned up. But man, it just kills me. Just kills me. So, little bit of sadness there to end on this note is he looked at it and goes, "No, it would make our book too big." Oh, man. Oh well. All right, my mush eaters. That's the end of my show notes. Thank you for listening. And I will catch you in the next episode. I'm going to try and keep these close to an hour as possible. But thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And I will see you in the next episode.
Old John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on.